That is a hard act to follow. So, yeah, thank you, Piero, for the invitation. As Piero mentioned, I'm a landscape architect, and I teach at UC Berkeley in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning. So very different than being a photographer. But today I'm going to talk very, very briefly about some of my current work, and I'll kind of do this in two parts. The first is that I'm going to talk about a kind of framing that a lot of my work kind of falls under, which is to directly challenge kind of historic and contemporary understandings of what the desert is and our perceptions of it, and how that directly affects the ways that we design those places or inhabit those places. And I do this not because I think deserts are inherently important, which I do, but largely because they're really entangled in all of our collective futures. So what happens in the desert inevitably has an impact in what happens throughout the rest of the world. And for every person, regardless of whether you live in a desert, you are affected by something that's happening in the desert. And then the second part of the talk, I'm just going to briefly show you a very, very new project that is attempting to kind of ground some of these ideas in an actual place that's in Chile, in the Atacama Desert, and kind of deals with AI in this contemporary moment. So this all really starts from a kind of deep acknowledgement that the global climate is trending towards both extreme wet and extreme dry conditions. And that most of the recent evidence of that comes from the International Panel on Climate Change. When they released their latest report in 2023, it kind of made in very clear and in no uncertain terms that the drylands are predicted to face higher temperatures and major reductions in precipitation and more erratic storms. And given that over a third of the globe is already classified as arid and semi-arid, it seems especially important that we heed these warnings, especially in light of kind of growing conditions of scarcity. So in this map, a lot of my work uses mapping as a way to kind of think through this. So in this map, I'm showing you only land masses that are classified as arid and semi-arid. And then these kinds of gray contour lines that are overlaid are predictions for reductions in precipitation for the next 100 years. So this map was actually made in 2017 with IPCC data from 2017, but it kind of still holds. And it demonstrates that the arid lands are going to inevitably expand much beyond their current footprint, and so we kind of need to kind of think through what that might look like. But despite these forecasts, contemporary adaptation planning kind of prioritizes strategies that deal with wetter conditions and often de-emphasizes the drier conditions. And by omission, kind of by leaving out these drier landscapes, we're kind of undercutting the significance of these places, both ecologically and also culturally. There's major populations that live in each of these places. And so I would argue that this omission of dry landscapes from kind of contemporary discourse and discussions has a lot to do with how dry lands have been described and visualized throughout European and Western history. Much of the descriptions of dry geographies are myths about emptiness or descriptions of deserts as spaces that lack something. So you often see images like this. Is a very famous photographer, Peter who is really known for photographing deserts, but it demonstrates a kind of approach to the desert. It's showing there are no people here, there's no sign of kind of vegetated life, there's a real kind of emptiness. And yet we know that these places are not spaces of emptiness. They're really rich and full, and so a lot of my work is kind of trying to get at what would it mean to reinterpret these places as full. So these are photographs from a project done by Megan Jones-Shiatani, who's a historian and landscape architect, where she's trying to kind of look through artifacts that were left in the deserts of Utah as remnants of internment of Japanese Americans. But these these myths about the desert as kind of empty or dead are really powerful, and they've influence so much of the way that we think about landscapes generally, but very specifically the way that we kind of plan for dry landscapes. And we can kind of trace that perception through the etymology of the word desert itself. So 12th and 13th century European definitions of the word directly translate desert into wasteland, and that comes from a late Latin term, desertum, which literally means thing abandoned. Architectural historian Vittoria de Palma kind of takes that further and argues that this comes directly from a kind of Judeo-Christian understanding of landscape, where desert and wasteland are kind of used as signifiers of immorality, and landscapes that are verdant and green are landscapes that represent virtue. We see that binary represented in many ways. I'm showing you a kind of iconic image from art history, Thomas Cole's Expulsion from the Garden of Eden from 1828, where he's emphasizing the contrast between the desert and the garden, both in the composition of a slit composition and in the ways in which he's visualizing the landscapes themselves. So on the right-hand side of the painting, you're seeing Eden, where Cole is depicting it as a verdant, lush, forested landscape. It's flooded with light. And then on the left, the desert landscape, it shows kind of Adam and Eve being thrust into this bleak and dark landscape where vegetation is dying. There's a kind of storm brewing. And these representations kind of reinforce a hierarchical ordering, with the Garden of Eden representing a kind of utopic or moral vision of the world, and that's kind of in stark contrast to the desert represented as a place of kind of immorality or danger. And while this ideology comes from a kind of religious concept, I would argue that this perception, which originates in a particular ideology, kind of permeates contemporary understandings of landscape. So these are the definitions of desert and wasteland that was taken from the Oxford English Dictionary just a few days ago. And actually the OED just did a big rewrite of their definitions a couple weeks ago. So these are like as new as possible. I think it was updated on September 30th or something. But again, desert and wasteland are kind of correlated. They kind of speak to each other. Desert is described as an uninhabited and uncultivated place, and wasteland is described as a place unfit for cultivation. And while that might appear to be a kind of discursive discussion, what I am kind of trying to grapple with is how that manifests in things like environmental science research, which purports to be kind of objective. So the kind of most iconic data set that many environmental scientists use is a land cover data set, which classifies lands through an association with an industry and types of vegetation, often with things like urban development or agriculture. And the category of barren land is characterized by many of the kind of quintessential ways you might describe a landscape. So dry salt flats, exposed rock, sparse vegetation. I would even say, go so far as to say that the term itself, barren, as a kind of classifier, is already doing work. It's already kind of rooted in judgment. By using the word barren, you're already kind of, by definition, deeming that these lands are maybe unproductive or lacking in some capacity. That kind of gets explained even further if you look at the written description of barren land, which is described as land with limited ability to support life. So really kind of devaluing landscapes that are directly correlating kind of value with economic productivity. And these are coming from a data set that was created in the mid-1970s, but this classification system is ubiquitous today. Almost every country throughout the world, this was developed by the US Geologic Survey, but it kind of surpasses the US context. Almost every country in the world uses this classification, and it kind of structures policy making and decisions about what kinds of strategies are embedded within landscapes. So one of the things that I was curious about is how this kind of, how you would actually kind of, would you be able to make a strong correlation between what is deemed barren and what is dry? And because so much of my work is about mapping, I decided to map these. So here you're seeing only the data that is that's identified as barren lands. This is a global, a MODIS global land cover data set. And then these are all lands that are classified as arid or semi-arid, kind of building from that previous map that I showed you. But if you overlay them, you kind of see directly that these two data sets are talking to each other. Almost every single parcel that is deemed barren is also classified as dry or arid. And so representing deserts as more than empty or deserted places is important in really thinking through kind of what we want our collective future to look like, and that includes desert landscapes. So this is kind of a framing of almost all the work that I do, is kind of thinking through how do we inscribe more value into dry landscapes. And then, as I said earlier, I'm going to show you the very, very early stages of a project. And you know, like full disclaimer that it is not fully baked, and this is kind of the first time that I'm sharing it. But the project is called the Hydrologic Atlas of AI, and it's a collaborative project with a colleague of mine at UC Berkeley, Victoria Moore. So I'm presenting this on behalf of both. But our work is really looking at the environmental consequences of AI infrastructure and locating the consequences of AI and its associated infrastructures, of acquired infrastructures within the desert. Even though we might think of the desert as being kind of dislocated from the center of technology, which is kind of apt that we're sitting in Palo Alto while we think through that. But the project kind of argues that the seat of AI technology is actually not in Silicon Valley, but is in fact in desert landscapes. And that these landscapes that are kind of removed geographically are actually what sustains and supports the innovation that happens in places like Silicon Valley. So the project reframes AI as an environmental process. It specifically reframes it as a water-based process that is dependent on physical infrastructure and quantifiable non-renewable resources. We're looking specifically at kind of tracking the way that water is used, because so much water is being kind of siphoned from the earth and then used to support all the kind of infrastructure that AI depends on. So that's everything from like the making of a chip to a data center that has compute power. The project builds from recent research that just came out earlier this year from UC Riverside, in which the researchers are quantifying how much water is actually used to write an email with ChatGPT, and they found that one kind of very, very simple email, so not anything that's doing kind of complex thinking work, will require an entire bottle of water. That's a stunning statistic if you think about the number of users that ChatGPT has just now in the first couple of years of its inception, and how much things like generative AI are part of things like workflows and people's day-to-day lives. So that made us curious about where this water was coming from and where it goes, and how all the component parts that kind of create the data center are kind of invested in cycles of water. And so our work kind of expands beyond the data center in a kind of systems approach, a systems analysis approach to track all the other water cycles that are embedded within AI. And that led us to focus on lithium and copper, two minerals that are kind of at the core of what sustains both the data center as a kind of architectural object, but also all the things that are embedded within the data center. And we do that by kind of thinking about a metaphor of two clouds. So we're thinking about one cloud, which is made of water, which kind of represents the environmental cycles of water, the kind of what you might call natural cycles of water, and then one cloud of AI that's made of data and algorithms and is perceived to be kind of immaterial and weightless. And we juxtapose these two clouds to kind of force a connection that exposes how AI is in fact deeply embedded within landscape processes and is like rooted to the ground. We also looked kind of more globally at the relationships between these sites of data centers and then geographies that are experiencing things like water stress. And what we found is that there is a kind of strong correlation between geographies that are going to are already facing water stress, but are going to increasingly face water stress, and where these sites of extraction and storage of data exist. And so we're trying to we're basically trying to kind of ground the cloud of AI that many of us kind of think is this thing that doesn't have any contours to it, ground it in place. So our project uses Chile as a case study for a number of reasons. Chile is the largest producer of copper in the world. It's responsible for almost a third of global production, and copper is a critical element in data center architecture, in AI chips, Ethernet cables, bus bars, interconnects between servers and racks. There, you kind of get into the nitty-gritty, it's kind of everywhere. Chile is also the second largest producer of lithium in the world, which accounts for almost more than a quarter of all global production. And of course, lithium batteries are essential to the production of AI, powering wireless devices and also sustaining what we might think of generative AI. Also, Chile is deeply invested in AI. So it is, like, as a nation, really kind of making sure it retains power in the world of AI. It sees it as like an economic opportunity. So it is producing all of this policy that really incentivizes companies to come and build data centers in Chile. It's also notable that Chile is in the 15th or 16th year of a mega drought, like the worst drought it's experienced in the last 100 years. But it kind of wants to be the seat of power of AI. And what we found is that really brings us back to the desert. So the extraction of lithium and copper are happening primarily in the Atacama Desert, which is in northern Chile. It's considered to be the driest place on Earth. And the production of lithium and copper require enormous amounts of water, both in the kind of literal extraction of the materials, but also in the processing of that material. And so we spent this summer in the Atacama kind of tracking how water moves through the desert. We wanted to kind of see on the ground how cycles of water are being transformed by and in service of AI infrastructure. So we kind of loosely followed this diagram. We started at the coast. We moved to the salt flats in the center of, in between the coast and the Andes. We got to the foothills of the Andes, and then we moved back to the coast, to the ports that are kind of distributing these products. And so we started, like I said, at the coast at a desalination plant. This is a plant that is taking Pacific seawater, filtering it, taking out all the salt, making it potable water, and then distributing it to both mining sites. So it's really kind of fueling copper mining, but it is also, this particular plant is supplying 100% of all potable water for the city in the desert that is called Antofagasta, and it's kind of the mining town of, the largest mining town in the Atacama. So a really kind of dramatic approach to dealing with scarcity is to just kind of take water from the sea, and of course that changes it requires all this kind of infrastructure to move that water from the coast to inland. And so as we traveled through the desert, everywhere we were seeing these pipes, and they were all kind of labeled so we could kind of track them. But they're moving, they're being transported across the desert through pipes and also in tanks on trucks. And then they're landing in places of extraction. So this is a copper mine. This is actually not the mine. This is just the tailings. So this is just the material they're moving from an open pit mine and kind of stacking into these human-made mountains or new topographies. And water and copper mining is used for both in really intensive ways to clean the stone, but also then they use kind of hydropower to actually extract the metal from the earth. We also attempted to go to a lithium site, but lithium is a tricky beast. It's very, very well secured. There's a lot of kind of environmental concerns with lithium, extraction, and so it was very hard to get access. We tried for months and it was unsuccessful, but you can see these three white, kind of in the distance, white fields of lithium shallow pools. So basically groundwater is being pumped from the salar, from the salty aquifer. In that salt, briny mixture is the lithium. They're spread over these huge, shallow ponds. And then over time, lithium is kind of exposed as the sun evaporates the briny water. And so what is actually happening is that groundwater is extracted in a place that's already kind of deeply reliant on scarce sources of water, and then just that water is just kind of allowed to be evaporated to what is then left behind is a lithium concentrate. We also went to a processing plant. This is a lithium processing plant to move it from lithium concentrate to lithium carbonate, which is the compound that is used for lithium ion batteries. But you can see this is the road as we approach the plant, and this kind of like yellow residue is indicative of just how toxic this process is. And so it's not just polluting the air, but also polluting the water source by which it's also depleting. So a very kind of tricky scenario. And then we returned back to the coast. So we came back to the port where we were. This is the port of Mejillones, which is the largest port in the Atacama, and it's moving materials. It's doing some processing of materials in these big plants, which are hydropowered. So again, desalinated water. You can see on these tanks, desalinated water, and using that water to produce heat, and then that steam is getting kind of released into the air, again, like water that's just kind of being evaporated, and then put on ships and in pipes and on cargo containers and shipped across the world. And then landing in places like this. This is a data center outside of Santiago, and you can see the kind of vapor of water that's being released from the data center. Kind of returning back to that idea that the data center, this is an AI data center, returning to the idea that like to write one email takes up a bottle of water, and you can see the steam coming off of that. But we also saw cycles of water that have been in process in the desert long before AI arrived. So this is Camanchaca. It's the name for the fog that's produced in the desert. The fog is captured and used by many local people, and it's diffuse and very little, but there's kind of a sensitivity to how the fog comes in from the Pacific. It's basically the Humboldt current creates this like extremely cold air that mixes with the dry, hot air of the desert and creates these clouds of fog. But the people who live here are like super sensitive to this, and so they've developed all these techniques for capturing that water and living sensitively with it. Also in the foothills of the Andes, water still in the desert, but water that is produced by precipitation, and on the eastern side of the Andes kind of comes down the Andes and gets channelized and used for things like farming practices and sustaining local communities that have been here for millennia. But many of these communities are obviously they're adjacent to these extractive industries that are supporting AI, and are kind of wrestling with what it means to kind of operate in a world where their water sources are being kind of reinterpreted and reimagined in the face of a growing need and demand for AI infrastructure. And so I'm just, to conclude, going to return to this idea of the metaphor of two clouds. So this is a kind of early conceptual kind of framework that we're working through, where we're basically saying that these two clouds, the cloud of water and the cloud of AI, produce their own kind of socio-environmental relationships. And we saw this kind of directly in Chile. But AI demands more and more AI. The more you use it, the more you depend on it, the more you need it. And so it's in this process of reproducing itself. And as that demand increases, it also requires more resources, which of course interrupts the flow of water that's coming from the natural cycle of water. So it's both kind of simultaneously intensifying and magnifying its own socio-environmental relationships. And in the process of more and more AI, material resources that are coming from the cloud of AI are kind of directly shrinking. So there's a kind of finite amount of water, and if water is getting moved to this cloud, it's taken away from this other cloud. And so what you end up with is that the cloud of AI keeps growing and demanding more and more, and that kind of forces the cloud of water to kind of shrink and live in service of the cloud. And so if we return to this map, this is where I'll end. I would just say that kind of looking at AI through the lens of environmental systems really challenges this notion that technological progress is inherently trending towards a collective good. And maybe more to the point of this particular talk in my own research interests is that the ways that deserts have been kind of exploited or imagined allows this process to be intensified. And allows the desert to be kind of made invisible in this process. I think most people are not, most people who are using AI in their everyday lives are not thinking, like every time I ask a query of AI that I'm taking water from a place or that I'm contributing to the climate crisis, especially when you think about the kind of the marketing of the green revolution as like lithium will save us. It's a kind of silver bullet for green infrastructure. So that's where I'll end. But yeah, I would just say that the project is very new. So any feedback would be useful. Thank you.